send me this, and I'm going, no. I don't know about you, but I ain't got the money for that.
Okay, good morning, everyone.
Oh, good morning.
Do we have, oh, we got sound. We got a noisy mic. Morning. How are you? Good to see you. Okay. Now we don't have sound. Okay, there you go. Great. Well, it is great to see this humongous crowd today. Yeah, it depends on your definition. Okay. I don't know, I just got a message from Rick Hastings.
What's that?
A message from Rick Hastings?
He's in Florida, isn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's probably bragging about how warm it is down there. Well, what in the world did you do?
Me and the wife, she's big, she's little, but she's really
Little
big.
but mighty. Okay, good morning, everyone. The digits on my watch tell me it's time for us to start. Isn't it interesting how our vocabularies change? We used to say the hands on my watch, and now it's, well, the digits on my watch are telling me it's time to get started. Before we do, though, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Our Father, we thank you that you've given us this morning. We thank you for the crisp air. It's exhilarating. We thank you for the sunshine. We ask you, Father, that you be with us today as we once again return to the book of James and learn from the words that you gave him to say to us. We ask you, Father, that you help us to have open minds and open hearts, that we might understand what it is that you have to say to us. This is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Well, when I picked these short books to teach, I thought, okay, this is going to be easy. These are short, little, simple books. Yeah. I know. James is turning out to be the most difficult book I have ever tried to teach. I mean, in comparison, teaching Revelation was like falling off a log. James has been real difficult. And we're 6 weeks into it, and only 2 chapters. We've got 3 more to go after today. So, Lyle, if I do it right, that'd be 2 chapters a week for the rest of the quarter, which means you probably can have 1 Peter if you want it.
Okay. Gotcha. Put it down.
One of the reasons I think that James is so hard, has been hard for me to teach, is he seems to be all over the place, doesn't he? He first, talks about being joyful in your trials. He talks about your trials creating endurance within you, and endurance then leading to the perfecting of your faith. And he seems to be all over the place. And when when somebody's trying to teach something, generally, at least me, okay, I generally look for a theme that at least, can lead me through part of the lesson. And so it's real hard, it has been real hard for me to pick out a theme. I mean, I can, remember from 45 years ago when I taught biology. I mean, I taught cell biology, and they see you have the cell wall, the cell membrane, you have the nucleus, nucleotides, and you have the mitochondria, and you have the Golgi bodies. Did I say that right, Frank? Golgi? Okay. You have the Golgi bodies, and my favorite, the endoplasmic reticulum. That's so fun to say. So I can remember that from 45 years ago, the last time I taught that subject, and yet it's hard to really figure out. Been hard for me to really figure out where James is headed with what he's been saying to us. And maybe a clue to where he's headed with this comes from the verse 1. When he said and introduces himself as what? Right, as who and as what? A bondservant. I am James, a bondservant of God and of Jesus Christ. Oh, okay. That's interesting. And then if we look at what a bondservant is, well, a bondservant is a person who does work for someone else without pay. In other words, a slave. And so a bondservant is obliged to do what his master tells him to do. And so a bondservant who doesn't do what his master tells him to do is no bondservant at all. And so he's a person who conducts himself based upon obedience to his master. Do I have the antenna on this thing rubbing against something? Or are you having an idea why it keeps dropping out? No idea. I don't need it. No, neither does my tech over there. So, okay. Well, we'll try to deal with it.
It's because you're bumping your mic.
Yeah.
Well, I got my mic down here.
A lot of times that movement shifts it, and that's what.
Yeah, it'll touch your shirt.
The more active you are, the more inactive it is.
Yeah, where it's not rubbing any cloth.
Okay, I'll see if that works. And then he's addressing this letter to the 12 tribes of Israel that are dispersed. Now, first of all, when he says the 12 tribes of Israel, we recognize that at that time there were only 3 recognizable tribes: Judah, Benjamin, and who were the priests? Oh, Levites. And so, for him to say that it was addressed to the 12 tribes of Israel, actually what he was saying was to other God believers, to others who believed in God. And in fact, as Paul said, well, all Christians are part of the family of God. They are of the spiritual family of Israel. And so we see that James was writing to people who were of a like mind with him. And we might say they too may have considered themselves to be bondservants or servants of God. So, what James seems to be talking about here is the way that a bondservant of God is to conduct his life. That a bondservant is obedient to his master. Bondservant of God, then, is obedient to God. And I may be borrowing the title of somebody else's book, but he seems to be talking about practical Christian living. And so when he says, for instance, turn the page, No, not ready for that yet. Turn the page back. Who's laughing at me? I know.
Just laughing with you.
Well, laughing with me. Okay, that's fine. That's fine. That's good. So, one of the things that he says, be joyful and produce endurance and be perfect and complete. What are these words that he's using? What kind of words are they?
You mean like adjectives?
I'm sorry?
You mean like an adjective, or what do you mean?
An adjective, a verb, a consonant, a pronoun, noun. What kind of words are they? Okay, they're imperatives. They're verbs. They're action words. They're words that say, take some action. And now I'm ready to turn the page. He's talking about living in such a way that your life reflects whom you believe in. Now, he takes a step back and he says, now, if any of you lack wisdom, in other words, if you lack the knowledge of knowing how to do this, then ask God for wisdom and he'll give it to you. Again, an action word. Ask God. If you believe in God, ask him. And then he has two negatives. Ask without doubting. That's kind of a negative action. And don't be double-minded. In other words, don't live with a foot in the world and a foot in the spiritual world, because that's being double-minded, and you're hedging your bet. You're saying, okay, if God doesn't answer my prayers, well, then I've got somewhere else to go. And he says, don't do that. But all of this is action, things that he wanted his readers to do. He said, if you are poor, be lifted up. If you are rich, be humbled. And then he contrasted two ways of living, two ways of acting, two ways of behaving. He contrasted evil conduct, which leads to death, with righteous conduct, which leads to life eternal. And so, James, are we beginning to see, I said, I want to find a theme. I want to find a thread running through this. Are we beginning to see a thread that James is pulling through this whole discourse? Continuing on, he said, be quick to hear. Two actions. Well, one's an adjective. Be quick is the way you do it. But anyway, be quick to hear, slow to speak, and be slow to anger. And again, these are action words. Put aside filthiness. Put aside wickedness. Receive, take into yourself, the implanted word. Prove yourselves doers. Now he gets to it. Prove yourself doers of the word and not hearers only. He says, one of the things that will distinguish you is that you care for the things and for the people that God cares for. And he says, remain unstained by the world and do not practice. Here's another one of those things we're not to do. Do not practice personal favoritism. See, these are all actions that a God believer, that a God believer, a bondservant of God, should do. And so, he's saying, Adrian, do you believe in God? Then this is the way you should act. he wants his readers to live as though they believe in God. Okay, that's my 15-minute, okay, let's get started talk. Now it's time to open it up for questions and comments. And but let me ask 3 questions. Where is James headed? Give me an answer to that question. Where is James headed? What is James saying? And then in particular, is there a central theme to what James is saying? Speak.
He's trying to teach us how to live as followers of God.
Okay, he's telling them to live as followers of God.
He said he's trying to tell us how.
He's trying to tell us how to live as followers of God. Okay? Anyone else?
Gary,
Yes.
one of the reasons for an apparent disjointedness, and there really isn't, is it, as you mentioned in verse 1, he's writing to the 12 tribes, which is God believers, scattered throughout the nations. And so, Ephesians, he's addressing a particular issue. 1 Corinthians, he's addressing 5 or 6 issues, but it's germane to the church in Corinth. Here he's writing to the reason these are general epistles because it's not written to any one particular group. So therefore, as they're scattered throughout the nations, their issues are different. Now, he's calling them, all of them, to live as they believe in God, but everyone has a different, one place is favoritism. Place over here, maybe it's faith and works. Over here, it's their speech. Over here, it's their prayer life. Over here, it's their lack of wisdom. So it's connected because he's writing about how they should live, but it's disjointed in the fact that it's just little vignettes.
And so it's not like 1 Corinthians where there are some problems in Corinth, and Paul addresses those specific problems. As Lyle has just said, he's talking to people who are scattered abroad, and each individual little cell where they may live, they have different issues. And so he's trying to cover all of these issues by telling them, here is how you should live as a believer in God. Did I capsulize that okay? All right, got a thumbs up on that. So, as we go forward now in the second half of chapter 2, and I'm really going to try to finish chapter 2. James is, you know what, he reminds me of a freight train. And he left the station kind of slow. And he's just chugging along, and then he slowly puts on steam. And he's going faster, and now all of a sudden he's hit his stride, and he's ready to open up and go full throttle. In 1969, I know many of you weren't born yet, or at least some of you weren't. I don't know. Let me look. Yeah, some of you weren't born yet. Well, I know. Some of you are as old as I am, or dare I say, older, but... In 1969, Neil Diamond had a popular song called Brother Love's Traveling Salvation Show. And it is a very popular song. In fact, I remember I was working stock for Standard Groceries. Everybody remember Standard Groceries? Yeah. So I was working stock for Standard Groceries, and that was all done at nighttime. You know, you go to the store now, and everybody's stocking while you're in there trying to buy stuff. Well, we didn't do that. We did it at night when no one was in the store. And we'd turn on the radio, and we'd have songs playing over the PA system. And this one would come on, and man, it just made me work so fast because it's just so energizing. And let me just read verse 2 to you. It says, the room gets suddenly still, and you'd almost bet you could hear yourself sweat. He walks in. Eyes black as coal, and when he lifts his face, every eye in the place is on him, starting soft and slow like a small earthquake. And when he lets go, half the valley shakes. And I get that feeling from James here. He is hitting his stride, and he's really about to let go with his message. And so, yes, he's talking about being a bondservant. He's talking about how a bondservant conducts himself. He's talking about how a bondservant is obedient. He's talking about how a bondservant, and here's the key word, does, kind of relates back to being a doer. A doer does what the master wills. James says that he himself is conducting himself as a bondservant. And so in a way, he's encouraging others to do the same. And as Paul said in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 1, be imitators of me, just as I also am of Christ. And I get the feeling that James is kind of saying the same thing. You know, here's the way that I live my life as a bondservant of Christ, and I'm encouraging you to do the same thing. And so, James returns to something that he introduced back in chapter 1. He says, but prove yourselves in chapter 1. I'm going to read verse 22 and skip 23 and 24 and go to verse 25. But prove yourselves doers of the word and not merely hearers who delude themselves. In other words, if you consider yourself to be a servant of God and yet you don't do what he tells you to do, you're just fooling yourself. You're just fooling yourself. You're actually not fooling anyone else because they see what you're doing. You know, take a step outside of your own body and look at what you're doing. If you claim to be a servant of God but don't serve God, then you're deluding yourself. But one who looks intently at the perfect law, the law of liberty, and we could speak all day long on that one, but we're not going to, and abides by it, not having become a forgetful hearer, but an effectual doer, this man will be blessed in what he does. And so James just kind of planted an idea back there in chapter 1. You know, kind of like move it up here so I don't have to move around. Like a symphony. You know, when a symphony starts off, near the beginning, a few notes are played that kind of tickle your ear. And then later on in the symphony, those same notes are played, but it's expanded. And we call this a theme. And it's kind of like in which one? Oh, yeah. Kind of like the Tara theme in Gone with the Wind. Yeah. Or maybe the Laura theme in Dr. Zhivago. And so these are themes of music that are introduced quietly and softly, and yet they grow and become a bigger part and become the reason for the music that is being played. And so I think that back here in chapter 1, James has started a theme. And he's introduced the theme of being a doer of the word, and now he returns to that theme. Chapter 2, verses 14 through 17. What use is it, my brethren, if someone says he has faith, but he has no works? Can that faith save him? If I say, I believe in God, but then I go about life doing everything that he says not to do, is that faith going to save me? The anticipated answer, of course, is no. If a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and be filled, and yet you do not give them what is necessary for their body, well, what use is it? Even so, faith, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself. Now, if we walk away from this verse simply thinking that James has taught us we're to care for the needy, then we've sadly missed the point. He's using that as an example. If I saw my son living up on the northwest side of Indiana or Indianapolis and he had no food and he had no heat, they turned his electricity off, and I said, well, son, be fed and be warmed, and I don't go up there and give him food and do something to get his house warmed up, do I really love him? James is using this as an example. He is using it to prove his point. You see, no amount of saying, go in peace and be warmed and filled, is going to warm up the person and make him less hungry. It's useless words. It's useless words. And James is saying that to say you believe, but don't back it up with actions that, what's the word I want? That reflect your belief, actions that show that, yeah, you actually do believe what was said. If you don't back your words up, then your faith is empty. It's dead. Now, as we move on to verses 18 and 20, because he keeps going, like I said, he's like that freight train, putting on steam and gathering up speed, and he just goes plowing right on into verses 18 through 20. And here's one of the reasons why I said James is a difficult book to teach. And I'm sure you've read these verses. And I'd ask you, well, how do you explain what he's talking about? How do you explain when he says, but someone may well say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without the works, and I will show you my faith by my works. You believe that God is one, you do well. The demons also believe and shudder. But are you willing to recognize, you foolish fellow, that faith is without works is useless? And people have struggled with finding some coherency to those three verses. And one theory is that he set up what's called a diatribe. Now, we're not talking about an angry, today when we talk about a diatribe, we're thinking about a bitter, abusive, angry speech. That's not what it meant, though, in Greek literature. In Greek literature, a diatribe was a speaker setting up a conversation. And in that conversation, he would speak about both pros and cons of a certain way of thinking. And so here, James has set up a diatribe. And the real question is, well, who's doing the speaking? One consideration is that the first person to speak is saying something that James disagrees with. And so in verses 18 and 19, he disagrees with what the person said. And yet, if that were so, then the person who made the initial statement would seem to should have said something that was contrary to what James believed. And yet, he seems to be saying what James does believe. So that may not be what's going on here. The other way of looking at it is that this first person, the someone who speaks, is saying, look, you've got works, I've got faith, it's all good, it doesn't matter. And James is saying, no, you're wrong. It does matter. He's saying they go together. You can't just have works and you can't just have faith. Faith and works go together like bread and butter, like toast and jam, like orange and juice. They go together. They don't stand alone. And so the other way of looking at this diatribe is that the someone who's speaking is actually saying what James believes. In fact, in the New American Standard, it says, but someone may well say, in other words, James is kind of tipping his hand here. He kind of agrees with what this person is going to say. Just a second, Frank, and I'll get right to you. And so it seems that maybe these whole 3 verses should have the quote marks beginning in verse 18 and ending in verse 20. Go ahead, Frank.
The best analogy I ever heard of faith and works was about 1973, and it had to do with a rowboat. One paddle was faith, and the other paddle was works. You know what happens if you just paddle on one side?
Yeah, you go in circles.
The other side,
Go in circles.
you have to go together.
Yes.
That's the best analogy I ever heard.
I like that. And so Frank is saying the best analogy you ever heard, in case you didn't hear, was rowing a boat. And when you row those oars, you have to roll them together. If you just roll on one side, you're going to go in a circle in one direction. You just roll on the other side, you're going to go in a circle in the other direction. If you don't roll them together, you're going to stand still. Man, I must be 8 years old again. Excuse me. And so you have to use the oars in unison. Thank you, Frank. That was a very good example. And so it's very possible that what James is saying here is one thought that he agrees with. You have faith and I have works. So show me your faith without your works. Show me what that looks like. Prove to me that you have faith without doing anything. And then he says, and I will show you my faith by my works. Now, you believe that God is one. You do well. The demons also believe and shudder. Now, they're not changing their ways. They're not saying, okay, we're going to do what God has said. No, they're continuing in their evil ways. But are you willing to recognize, you foolish fellow, that faith without works is useless? Moving on. I just spoke 2 pages of my lesson plan without even looking at it. Can you believe that? You see, the point that James is making is that faith is expressed by action. Without an accompanying action, a verbalized faith is useless. Now, James realizes that some of his readers may not be agreeing with him. In fact, they may have their fingers in their ears and they're not wagging their heads back and forth. No. And so he gives them a history lesson. He says, beginning in verse 21, was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up Isaac, his son, on the altar? You see, faith was working with his works. And as a result of the works, faith was perfected. And the scripture was fulfilled, which says, and Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. What did he believe from God? What is it that God said to Abraham that Abraham believed?
promise of a nation through his son.
The promise of a nation through Isaac. And yet here God is saying, Abraham, go sacrifice your son on the mountaintop. And Abraham believed that even though he would do what God told him to do, that God would still provide a nation through Isaac. And so this was reckoned to him as righteousness. And he was called the friend of God. You see that a man is justified by works and not by faith alone. He's not saying he's justified by works alone. He's saying he's justified by faith and works together. In the same way, was not Rahab the harlot also justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them on out by another way? And then he makes a key statement. For just as the body without the spirit is dead, so also faith without works is dead. You see, when God formed Adam, he took this lifeless dirt and he formed what looked like a body of a man. But it wasn't until he breathed his spirit into that lump of clay that it became alive. The Spirit is the motivating force within you. It's what causes you to move. In biology, we say if it doesn't move, it's dead. If it doesn't have action, it's dead. It's just a lump of protoplasm. And so he's saying, faith is like that. A verbalized faith without action, without works, is dead. And if we look at a parallel teaching in Hebrews, and we don't know who wrote Hebrews, and for those of us who believe that it was Paul, this kind of negates that argument that Paul and James didn't agree with each other. Because what the Hebrew writer says in chapter 11 is just so perfectly dovetailed with what James has just said in chapter 2 of the book of James. And so he told us that Abel offered a better sacrifice. How? By faith. Now, Scripture doesn't really tell us what that means because we don't know what the instructions were for that offering. If you go to Genesis 4 and begin with verse 3 and read through verse 8, all we know is that Abel presented a sacrifice that was acceptable to God. He brought of the first of the flock, the firstborn of the flock, he brought the fat portions. He brought these and he offered them to God. It says that Cain gave his offering from his harvest, but it was rejected by God. Now, some have tried to say, well, that means that he was supposed to offer an animal sacrifice, not a grain sacrifice. And that really doesn't wash because in the law of Moses, a grain sacrifice was required. In fact, the day after, or the first day of the week following Passover, look, when you get to be 70 and over, you got to search for your words, right, Frank?
Yes.
That first day of the week following Passover, the high priest at sunrise stood before God and did a wave offering. He waved the first fruits of the harvest before God and said, God, here is the first fruits and we're giving them to you. And so it wasn't a matter of the grain wasn't an appropriate offering. Maybe, and we don't know this is a maybe. Maybe Cain, kept the best part for himself and gave God the leftovers. We don't know. And there's another possibility. Genesis tells us that Cain became angry. And this isn't just, you know what, I don't like what you did and I'm really mad at you. No. This was an anger that leads to murder. And God knew this was in his heart. Maybe that's why his sacrifice was rejected, because God knew the heart of Cain. And Jesus said, if you come to the temple and you bring your sacrifice and you suddenly remember that you have some problem between you and your brother, lay down your offering at the altar and go and make friends with your brother, then come back and do your sacrifice. Maybe that's why Cain's offering was rejected. But the point is, God knew the heart of Abel, and God knew the heart of Cain. And he knew that Abel was doing his sacrifice out of love and obedience to God. And Cain wasn't. Cain seemed to have believed in God. The demons do too. He seems to believe in God because he did offer a sacrifice. But maybe his heart just wasn't in it. Three minutes, which means I'm probably going to go 5, right? Yeah, probably. Noah. He says, by faith, Noah prepared the ark. Well, what does that mean? Well, God told him to prepare an ark. He said, I'm going to destroy the earth with rain and with a flood. And so, Noah didn't say, oh, hey, we got this covered, God, we'll just swim. No. He believed God, that God was going to destroy the earth. He believed God when God gave him a design for a boat. What's a boat? What's an ark? Noah had never seen one. And yet he built it because he had faith in God. We've already talked about Abraham. In Hebrews, the Hebrew writer points out Abraham twice. He says, first of all, Abraham left his father's home because God told him to. God told him, I've got some place for you that's going to be yours. I want you to leave your father's home and I want you to go there. And without knowing where he was going or what he was going to find, Abraham believed that God had prepared a place for him, and he headed that direction. And then he offers also the same example that James offered, that Abraham offered his son Isaac, knowing full well that God had promised to make of Isaac a great nation that would outnumber the stars, outnumber the grains of sand on the beach. And yet, he reasoned, God is capable of raising Isaac from the dead and still fulfilling his promise. And because he believed in God and believed his promise, he was willing to do what God told him to do. Now, 1 minute. Did Abraham have failings? You better believe it. Did Abraham ever sin? You better believe that one too. Did Abraham ever act in an unrighteous manner? Did he ever tell someone that his wife was his sister? Yeah, Abraham had failings. But here's the thing. His life was characterized, now get that, his life was characterized by obedience to God's commands. Characteristically, Abraham did what God told him to do. Characteristically, David did what God told him to do. So, where's James headed? What is James saying? Does James have a theme? And I think the answer is yes. James' theme is this: that the life of a bondservant is characterized by faithful obedience to God. Thank you for being here this morning. We got through chapter 2. We'll begin with chapter 3 next week. Thank you so much for being here.
Try to grow a beard. Teenager, his dad said, son, you have a Western beard. I said, really? He said, yeah, you have a lot of wide open spaces. Okay, I'm not trying to grow one. I am. I got shoveled out finally.
Oh, that's true. Good morning, good morning.
Yeah, I mean, every 2.5 years, you went somewhere else. Belated birthday.
Yes, I think it. Now, is it called the West Side Church of Christ?
No, they're chapel.
West Side.
West Side Church of Christ is off the side. And now they're in the
Yeah.
that all the time. No, I know that for a long time, and I thought they could hear something. Well, I mean, the one I see you in, I don't know. Yeah, maybe something they're happy. Anyway, so that. That's a fun commercial, though. That's a really fun commercial. It's a fun commercial. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
Anyway. Good morning. They are. Crossing.
Yes. Was it? Only you could see it. Like, no, everybody else got it right. Are you serious? What was Shelby holding? It didn't even look like animal crackers. It was animal crackers.
So you got it wrong. So you're not going along.
She's going. She only got 1/3 of it wrong. She got the other parts right of that same question. So, I don't see how it looks like hot Cheetos, but you know. I'm pretty sure there's not a G.
I felt no G.